Next slide, please. And it's probably important to think about this in terms of ages. These heat maps go from left to right over time, so the right is the most recent, and from bottom, which is children under the age of 16, up to top, which is people over 60. And as you can see, what happens in every area is that it gets darker, meaning there's more cases all the way through the period we're looking at, and it steadily moves up the ages. So it doesn't remain constrained just to one age group. And the top line is beginning to darken in every part of the country. And those are the people over 60 who, as I say, will translate over time into some cases in going to the NHS. Next slide, please. And we're now beginning to see this. This is moving over to NHS activity. We're beginning to see this with a rise in the number of hospital admissions in England by age group, and this is just looking at people at different age groups. There is a rise in virtually every age group in older adults, basically anyone over the age of 45. There's a rise in number of people going into hospital with COVID over time, and this is obviously going up not in a straight line, but in an accelerating line. Next slide, please.
Yes.
If we compare the number of people in hospital at this moment with the first peak of COVID, these are NHS people in NHS beds in England by NHS region. Currently, only in the northwest is this coming close to the peak that we previously had, but it is increasing in every area. And if we do nothing, the inevitable result is that these numbers will go up. And they will eventually exceed the peak that we saw in spring of this year. Next slide, please. And therefore, if you look at the NHS as a whole, inpatient beds, dark blue is August, light blue is September, and purple is October. You can see it was still falling in August. In September, initially flat, and then a very gradual increase in numbers, but now it is going up steadily on an exponential curve. Next slide, please. Looking at individual hospitals, NHS hospitals, these are the hospitals with more than 100 COVID inpatients in them. This number will increase over the next weeks. And in green are hospitals which have got below half of their previous peak. In orange is the point where they actually get to half the number of people in hospital they had at the COVID peak. And in red is where they exceed the number of hospital inpatients they had at the peak of the first wave of this. And as you can see, the progression is steady, and we now have several hospitals with more inpatients with COVID than we had during the peak in spring. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the death rate, although rising, is still significantly below the peak. But the mortality rate, the death rate, will track the number of people going into the NHS over time with a significant delay. And we're seeing increases now that are quite noticeable in the northwest, Yorkshire and Humber, the northeast, and increasingly in the Midlands as well. But the other areas will follow because they will follow the NHS admissions. So that's all the data in terms of looking backwards. Those have already happened. Patrick is now going to talk briefly about the projections forwards.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? So just to recap, at the moment, these are three different ways of looking at it from different studies or the consensus group from the modellers. The number of people every day with COVID, catching COVID new, and it's 50,000 plus most likely as the number, and perhaps 500,000 people or more overall with the disease. Next slide, please. The R was relatively flat and below 1. Below the red line means the epidemic is shrinking, above the red line means it's growing. And you can see from August onwards, the R went above 1, the epidemic grew and continues to grow. So although some of the measures that are in place have eased off perhaps the rate of growth, it's still growing. And that growth from a high baseline means numbers get very big quite quickly. Because of this continued R above 1, the modelling group asked a number of academic groups to create scenarios as to what might happen on assumptions that R stays above 1 and goes between 1.3, 1.5 and possibly up over the course of the winter. And the next slide shows the early working from 2 weeks ago of some of those groups looking at deaths in England over the winter period. So this is early work scenarios looking at this on the assumptions of R, different groups, and as you can see, different groups come up with different answers depending on their models. But what is clear from all of them, in terms of deaths over the winter, there's the potential for this to be twice as bad or more in terms of the first wave compared to the first wave. So the models are clearly showing that this could be the case in these scenarios that are presented here. I want to move though from scenarios to now looking at the 6-week projections, which are more based on data now and have greater certainty than you can ever get when you're looking months ahead. This shows the hospital daily admissions. You can see the first peak on the left-hand side, and then over to the right-hand side you come up to date, today, and then the projections forward over the next 6 weeks. And this is a consensus view across a number of modelling groups. And what you can see here is a projection that over the next 6 weeks into early December, the numbers exceed the numbers of hospitalisations in the first wave peak. And as Chris has already said, in some hospitals you see that already, but this suggests across the country as a whole we would see this. Some hospitals earlier than others, some a bit later, but this is the projection in terms of hospital admissions over the next 6 weeks, with the uncertainties in the shaded blue area. Next slide, please. Inevitably, hospitalisations lead, unfortunately, to deaths in some people. Again, you can see the first wave on the left-hand side, and the dotted line indicates the top of the first wave. And on the right-hand side, you can see the projection from today going forward in the blue. And again, the light blue indicates the uncertainty range. But what you can see is the model suggests increasing, the models, this is a consensus across models, suggest increasing deaths over the next 6 weeks, so that by the beginning of December, the 8th of December, this is very close to the first wave peak, if nothing is done. Now, clearly, if you stop the R from increasing, if you allow the R to come down, then you would flatten this off and then potentially reverse it. But on the current trajectory, that is what is thought to be the prediction for deaths over the next 6 weeks. And of course, that would continue to go up because the hospitalisations already exceeded the first wave peak. By this time, deaths would follow. So unfortunately, that's a very grim picture in terms of what this looks like in the absence of action and continued growth. Next slide, please. This is a complicated slide. It's from the NHS and it shows what the impact of this would be on NHS beds. So on the left-hand side is acute hospital beds, and on the right-hand side is ventilator beds. It's the same curve you've just seen, so the first peak on the left and then the projection on the right. So the projections that I've just shown you lead, when the NHS do their bed calculations, as peak usage being exceeded on the 20th of November. That's obviously not a precise estimate, but where this would fall on average, that the extra available beds would then be exceeded a couple of days later, 3 days later, and then extra capacity caused by having to postpone, unfortunately, all the things that nobody wants to postpone gets exceeded sometime later in December. And a similar picture is seen on ventilator beds, where the peak gets reached at the towards the end of November or in December, and the currently available get breached a little bit earlier. So this is a picture of what the NHS pressures would look like under the scenarios that are in the 6-week projection. I'll hand back to you, Prime Minister.
Oh, thank you very much, Pat.